lesson this morning is entitled Abraham and Isaac. We're still in the series on the beginning. Let me also reiterate for those of you who are interested in the daily devotionals we have. Out here on the table in the vestibule, you'll see a black basket that has the daily devotional that matches this covenant series that we're doing. I encourage you to get it. Grab it, pick it up, and it gives you something for 5 days of the week, Monday through Friday. Different things to think about and to help walk you through the lesson and the ideas that we're talking about in the Word of the Lord this week. So that said, our focus verse this morning comes from Genesis chapter 12, which reads, "And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing." You know, there are people who are very trusting individuals. There are some people that, you know, if you talk to my son, particularly Owen, he is the kind of person that if he meets you, he trusts you. He does not meet a stranger, for one, and everybody that he encounters, they're a friend and he trusts them implicitly. But then you have people like myself who've been through some difficult times in life, and trust just becomes harder. I'll be completely honest with you. There are very few people in this world that I trust 100%. My wife is one of them. Brother and Sister Martin are a couple others. And other than that, I can't say that I trust anybody else 100%. Now, that's not to say anything negative towards anybody here. I do trust many of you guys. But the fact is, I often feel reserved in giving people my trust because when you've been hurt, when you've been harmed, it becomes difficult to trust people at times. And for some people, it is difficult to trust in certain areas and not in others. But what we need to learn to do is, while it is difficult for us to trust in one another at times, because, I mean, let me tell you something, for those of you who are unaware of how I view the pastorate and how I view men and women of God, I as a pastor, it is my job to lead and guide the flock of God, of God's people, right? It's my job to pray for you. It's my job to uplift you and to preach and to correct and to guide. That's the job of a pastor. And I wholeheartedly believe that much of that comes by leading by example. That I need to live a godly life, and as such, to use the words of Paul, I teach you to follow me as I follow Christ. But I want you to understand something. Though I stand here a man of God, I'm exactly that. I'm a man. I'm fallible. I make mistakes. And though I can't say that I have malintent towards anybody else, towards anybody, what I can say is that unintentionally at times, I may break your trust, because that's what happens. People make mistakes. The most trustworthy and loving individual that you can ever encounter will at times break your trust. It may not be malicious, but it happens. However, while men, and by men I mean mankind as a whole, while mankind will make mistakes and slip up and break your trust, let me tell you somebody who never will. His name's Jesus. God will never betray you. And in fact, what I have found through my 40-some odd years of life is that even when you betray God, even when you turn your back on Him and you run the opposite direction, He, like the father of the prodigal son, sits there with wide open arms saying, "When you come back, I'm ready. When you come back, I'm there for you." His love never wavers. His love never fails. Because that is our God. I'm going to read you this story about a husband and wife who were having another little boy. Like the first time 3 years prior, a few complications required surgery for the deliverance of their new baby boy. And they heard it, the loud cry of a beautifully newborn life. Healthy, this baby boy made those complications seem trivial. The struggle, the pain, it didn't seem to matter. Within a few days, Mom recovered very easily, and within a few days, the entire family made their return to the home, and they settled into what is now their new normal with a newborn baby boy in the house. Mom and the sons would stay home for the rest of the summer, with Grandma coming to help as much as needed and as often as needed. Dad, well, he prepared to return to work on Monday with an ample supply of pictures to proudly display his new baby boy. And upon entering the office, he could feel like something was wrong. Something was off. There was tension in the air. Now, of course, he received the obligatory, however sincere, "Congratulations, my friend," from all of his coworkers. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing out on something, that there was something he did not understand. Something had muted the celebratory atmosphere that he expected. Didn't take long to figure out why, when all of a sudden he hears his manager, "Mark, can you come into the office for a minute, please?" Mark came in and sat down, and his manager continued, "Mark, as you well know, this is a startup company, and we've been running off the funds from investors. And I really don't know how else to tell you this, but those funds are running out in the next week. We can't pay your salary any longer. And unfortunately, your position is going to have to be eliminated." Mark's feelings changed so fast, like lightning. He went from being excited and elated to brag about his new baby boy to completely and utterly devastated. The company had made promises. They helped him plot out his career path. He even ignored opportunities from other companies because he was invested in this startup. And everything changed. Not only did the father have to immediately begin looking for another job, but he had to do so with his wife recovering from surgery, having a 3-year-old son who's about to have his tonsils taken out, and have a baby who's simply a week old. And they were all depending on Mark to provide food, clothing, shelter, everything else. Not to mention all the medical bills that hadn't even started coming in yet from the child's birth. Fear, anxiety, and worry began to set in, and Mark began to try to pray. Because he knew that unlike him, God was not in a state of shock over the situation. God knew what was going to happen. He had foreseen it, and his words quickly morphed into tears as he's sitting there trying to pray to God. Words don't form, just simply tears form. And just then he remembered his last conversation with his grandmother in the nursing home a few years ago, just about a week before she died. They had talked about living for God. They talked about all the exploits and all the stories that she had. And when he finally come to it and asked her what her favorite Bible verse was, in a cogent moment she replied, "I don't remember exactly where it is or exactly what it says, but I've always liked the one that says, 'I was young and now I'm old, but I have never seen the righteous forsaken, nor his seed begging for bread.'" Mark's grandmother paraphrased Psalm 37:25, and that instantly became an anchor in his spirit. Mark had always trusted God with his family, with his finances. And trusting God had proved to be faithful. So now, between job interviews, Mark would help at home. He would wash bottles. He would change diapers. He would run his oldest son to have his tonsils taken out while mom and baby and grandma sat at home. The insurance covered more of the medical bills than he had expected. That was a blessing. And by the end of the summer, he had a job offer with a salary higher than what he had before, and benefits even greater than what he had lost with the previous position. Now, as I read this story, as I explain to you this position of Mark, I'm sure many of us can recount being in a very similar situation. Just a few short years ago in September, I was in in fact, it was 3 years ago. I was in that exact predicament. Company I was working for, the revenue wasn't where they wanted it to be, and I get a call not from my boss's boss, but the guy above him. And he says, Mike, I hate to tell you this, but unfortunately we're going to have to let you go. We're not firing you, it's a layoff because we need to cut the workforce. He said it's effective immediately. You have 15 minutes to go meet with your team to say your goodbyes. They gave me a decent severance package. I got to keep all the computer equipment, which, being a computer guy, I was pretty happy about that. I still have it, to be honest with you. But I'm sitting here looking at things that's like, God, my wife doesn't work. She's a stay-at-home mom. In fact, at that point in time, I think she was still working on her master's degree. And so not only is she not working, she's spending money at college. God, and I pastor a church, and, I'm pastoring a small church, and the church can't really survive without my tithes. And now I have no money coming in to pay tithes on. And I immediately started questioning, God, what's going on here? Because I was faithful in my finances. I was faithful to the house of God. I was faithfully walking in covenant with him. I was doing everything that I was supposed to do. My question for you is, can you trust God when you don't understand what he's doing? Can you trust God when it seems like your livelihood is ripped out from under you? We read the story of Mark, and just a few short months later, he's offered a position with a higher salary and better benefits. And I can tell you from personal experience, that's exactly how God works. Because shortly after being laid off in September, by February of the next year, I had a job with a salary making twice as much, with benefits even greater. It's helpful to understand that these surprises do not catch God off guard. Paul rightly wrote to the Roman church in Romans 8:28. He said, all things work together for good to them that love God and to them who are called according to his purpose. When you are walking in covenant with the Lord, you have to trust that everything God is doing, he's doing for the benefit of his church, the benefit of his kingdom. And if you are in his church, it's for your benefit. I did not see the benefit in losing my job that day on September 14th, 2022. I didn't see it. I was some kind of upset. But a few months later, as my severance ran out, and my savings account was nearing that zero balance, and I get a job with double the salary, with a lot more flexibility, with greater benefits, suddenly I realized God knew what he was doing all along. And if we'll just trust in him, if we just place our faith in him. You know, as we talk about the beginning of the earth and creation story, we're familiar with the flood. In fact, that's what we talked about last week. And after the flood waters had washed away all the wickedness from the earth, humanity had still yet a propensity to sin. God desired the descendants of Noah to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth as he commanded them in Genesis chapter 9. But instead, those called to replenish, they rebelled. Their stated goal, noted in Genesis chapter 11, was to let us make us a name, lest we be scattered upon the face of the whole earth. Seemingly unaware of God's covenant and knowingly disobedient of his command, the people set out to establish for themselves a permanent residence with a man-made tower at the center of it, a source of pride and protection from any future floods that God might try to use to wipe the earth clean again. Yet again, humanity deserved full and final judgment, and yet again, God chose to bestow mercy instead. In another example of undoing what he'd done initially, the one who brought to disorder in the days of creation introduced disorder to the rebellious people by confusing their language at the Tower of Babel. Suddenly, they were unable to communicate one with another. So they had no choice but to stop their ill-advised tower building program and spread across the earth as the Lord had initially commanded them to do. God continued to prove himself faithful to his covenant despite what humanity deserved. And as the population of the replenished world increased, so did the sin. Another flood was absolutely justified. Perhaps the first few times it rained after the flood waters receded, they breathed a sigh of relief when the rain would stop and flood waters didn't rise. But after each thunderstorm, arched through the sky as if suspended from heaven itself, hung the promise of God, the rainbow of God's covenant. It reassured all of humanity that God was faithful to his promise. Free will remained one of God's greatest gifts to humanity. And those who willingly obeyed the Lord reaped the blessings of the Lord. Before the flood, Noah found grace in the eyes of God, and his obedience brought salvation for himself and for his family and to the animal kingdom. And generations later, God's call for obedience was heeded by another man, Abram. Genesis 12:1 reads, "Now the Lord said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country and away from thy kindred and from thy father's house, and unto a land I will show thee." And we realize just a few short verses later, Abram departed as the Lord had spoken unto him in verse 4. Abram heard a command from God, and he obeyed the command without knowing exactly where he was going, without knowing what he would have to do. And his obedience resulted in a covenant with a promise from God to make him a blessing to all nations. You know, we can be eternally grateful that God does not give us what we deserve. Because to be honest with you, we all deserve judgment. We all deserve hell. There's not a single person in this sanctuary right now that is not worthy of hell. But instead of judgment, instead of condemnation, God has chosen to show us mercy. God has chosen to give us grace. Where we deserve death, he gives us life. Like a judge allowing a guilty person to go free, the mercy of God allows us to escape the death penalty of sin. But just because God is holy, because he's holy, he simply cannot ignore sin. Somebody has to pay the penalty. Somebody has to suffer the sentence that we deserve. The gospel, the beautiful covenant God's word keeps pointing toward, it teaches us that God himself took our sins and our sorrows, that he paid our penalty, that he suffered our sentence of death. The covenant blessings of God go well beyond a spiritual pardon. Not only do we not get what we deserve because of his mercy, but we get what we do not deserve because of his grace. Jesus proclaimed boldly in John chapter 10 and verse 10 when he said, "I am come that they might have life and that they might have it more abundantly." Genesis 17:5, God renamed Abram to Abraham, a name that literally means father of many nations. And ironically, when God first called them, Abraham and Sarah were advanced in age and childless. Not exactly the best choice of people to birth a plethora of nations from. When you're in your 80s and 90s and you have no children, the likelihood of you producing a large family is not high. But God proved yet again that he can make something out of nothing. That he can take an impossible situation and make something possible. God cured Sarah's barrenness and gave her the promised son, Isaac. And what Abraham and Sarah hoped would be an unveiling shortly after receiving the promise proved to be more of a slow 25-year unfolding of God's prophetic work as they walked in covenant with him. God promised the following to Abraham in Genesis 12. He said, "And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing, and I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed." The rest of the Bible's grand story invites readers to observe Abraham's journey of faith as God's fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant unfolds with each faith-filled step. Thanks to Abraham's obedience and God's faithfulness, we remain beneficiaries of God's plan to bless the nations through Abraham. If we could go back to first grade language arts for a moment. I'm sure many of us can remember terms such as nouns and verbs. I hope we all remember them. If not, we're about to have an English lesson. But nouns, as you know, are people, places, and things, inanimate, stationary objects. Whereas a verb is an action. And when you read in the word of the Lord, you find certain words such as believe and obey. These are action words. They are verbs. And like Noah, Abraham put his feet on his faith when he believed and when he obeyed. When God told Abraham to go, Abraham went. As Abraham walked with God, God continued to reiterate and refine his covenant. Not surprisingly, however, Abraham battled fear and doubt along the journey. He even sired a son by the name of Ishmael when God didn't answer as quickly as Abraham had hoped he would. During one moment of doubt, God told Abraham, "Look up to the sky and try to count the stars." This was enough reassurance for Abraham. Because the Lord was saying, as numerous as the stars are, is as numerous as your descendants shall be. And Genesis 15 records that he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. See, the sign of the covenant for Noah was a rainbow in the sky. For Abraham and his descendants, it was circumcision. God commanded in Genesis 17, "And ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token of the covenant betwixt me and you." Then God unfolded another prophetic page in his great master plan. "But my covenant," he said in Genesis 17:21, "will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah bare unto thee at this set time the next year." Abraham obeyed him immediately. He and his entire household were circumcised. And thanks to Abraham's faithful obedience, the multi-generational covenant blessing reverberates still yet today. Abraham's relationship with God serves as an example of how God desires to interact with humanity. He directs and we follow. He has a master plan for all of humanity collectively, but it unfolds in our lives individually. The New Testament opens with these words, Matthew 1:1. "The book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham." When Abraham looked up to count the night sky, the stars in the night sky, little did he know that one of those stars that he counted as his descendants would be Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the physical manifestation of God, the bright and morning star. All nations of the earth are blessed through the lineage of Abraham because of the salvation offered by Christ Jesus. A salvation obtained through belief in and obedience to his gospel, the death, the burial, and the resurrection. See, Abraham's walk of faith was not always an easy one. After Abraham received his promised son, God instructed Abraham to take Isaac up onto Mount Moriah. Now, some of you who are familiar with the story, you already know where this is going. But for those who don't know it, God had looked to Abraham and he said, this boy that I blessed you with, your promise, take him up there and sacrifice him. Spill his blood in worship to me. Child sacrifice was a deplorable, however common practice back then. It was practiced amongst the pagan tribes and surrounding areas, but never had the God of all creation ever commanded such an act. So is Abraham willing to do for his God what the pagans did for theirs? Abraham gathered the materials for the sacrifice. He bundled up the wood, had the boy carry it, took the ropes. Abraham put his knife in his sheath on his belt. As they began to walk up the mountain, the boy looks to his father and asks about the lamb. Dad, where is the lamb for the burnt sacrifice? In a bold and profoundly prophetic statement, Abraham spoke in faith as he announced, my son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. By this point in Abraham's covenant walk with God, he had learned to trust God entirely. The writer of Hebrews provided insight into Abraham's perspective as he wrote in Hebrews 11, 17 through 19, and he said, by faith Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac. And he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, that in Isaac shall thy seed be called, accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead. As a father, I stand here wondering, how could a father obey such a command to sacrifice his only son? But you see, Abraham, he had unshakable faith that the God who gave him his son is the God that would raise his son back up. You can see evidence of this in how Abraham spoke to the servants as they left the caravan and began to work their way up the mountain. God had only given Abraham the command to sacrifice Isaac, and he turns to the servants to say, you guys wait here, the boy and I will return. Some might say that Abraham was expecting God to provide a different sacrifice and that he wouldn't have to kill his son. But if you follow the rest of the story, that doesn't seem to follow with Abraham's actions. As Abraham, he builds the altar as instructed. He lays the wood out on the altar, and then the Bible describes that he took the ropes and he bound his own son, hand and foot, and laid him upon the altar. And Abraham grabs his knife from his belt, and as he raises his knife above his head, then the Lord speaks. Abraham was ready to plunge the knife into his son's own heart, not because he was wanting to kill his son, but because he trusted when God said, this is your son, and from him I will give you blessings, but I also want you to sacrifice him. Abraham said, okay, God, I don't know what you're doing, but I trust you, and he began to follow every single step. The Lord stopped him because the Lord was testing his faith. God never has demanded child sacrifice, nor will he ever. God honored Abraham's faith. And as the story goes, the angel stopped him before he could sacrifice his son. And as this relieved father lifted up his eyes, he saw a ram caught in a thicket. For truly the Lord had provided a sacrifice in that moment. And it was then that Abraham glimpsed God as Jehovah Jireh, the Lord who provides. In beautifully prophetic form, this episode foreshadowed a future moment when God incarnate, Jesus Christ, would willingly offer himself at Calvary as a sacrificial lamb for all the sins of humanity. He quite literally provided himself as a sacrifice, the only sufficient substitute for the death of humanity rightly deserved. Abraham believed God could raise his promised son after death. Jesus' empty tomb proved that Abraham's faith was justified. The promised son, the Son of God, rose victoriously over death after just 3 days. Peter made it clear while preaching at the temple that the Abrahamic covenant was fulfilled through Jesus Christ and sealed with the promise of the Spirit. In Acts chapter 3, he said, "Ye are the children of the prophets and of the covenant which God made with our fathers, saying unto Abraham, and in thy seed shall all the kindreds of the earth be blessed. Unto you first God, having raised up his Son Jesus, sent him to bless you, in turning away every one of you from his iniquities." A wise individual once said, "A faithful man walks by faith in the present while preparing for the future." Years later, Abraham's sweet, lovely wife died, and Abraham once again proved his exemplary faith. He purchased the cave at Machpelah in the Promised Land as a place to bury her. Generations later, Jacob charged his sons to bury him there as well. Over 400 years later, when the Israelites finally made it into the Promised Land, they did so by following the footsteps of Abraham. In a final act of faith, Abraham purchased the land and therefore staked a claim of faith on the promise of God. Abraham, like you and I, was human. He dealt with impatience, with doubt, with frustration, like we each do. And while waiting for God's promises to come to pass, being in covenant with God does not always mean that everything will make perfect sense. It doesn't mean that everything will always go the way you expect it to or the way you want it to. But you've got to understand, God has not called us to understand. He's called us to trust. God proves himself trustworthy every day with each new sunrise, with his Spirit inside us and his word to guide us. We have every reason to put every season into his nail-pierced hands, for they will hold us well. Speaking again of Jesus, the writer of Hebrews wrote in Hebrews chapter 2, "Again and again I will put my trust in him." Is there a step of trust where you need to take it and say, "Again"? November 16th, 2017. CBS News released a story on their website with the following headline: "Australian diplomat playing a game of trust dies in fall off of terrace." Julian Simpson, if we could go ahead and put his picture up for you. This man here and several others wanted to see the lights of the Empire State Building while on a terrace on the 7th floor of an apartment building. A disagreement broke out between Julian and another man. 30-year-old Simpson leaned over the ledge to play the trust game, hoping to show his trustworthiness. And the friend, James Waugh, told the police he held out his arm to catch Simpson. But the diplomat lost his grip and toppled over the ledge at about 1:35 a.m., coming to a quick and sudden stop on a second-story landing just outside the building. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The harrowing ordeal illustrates the limitations of our trust in other human beings, if not also the lack of wisdom. There will be people in our lives whom we can trust, and we endeavor to reciprocate said trust by being trustworthy for them. But there is only one who is perfect in all of his ways. Proverbs tells us that we are to trust in the Lord, that he does all things well, and that his timing is perfect. See, trust is easy when we feel close to God. It's easy when we can hear the voice of God. It's easy when we can see his plan clearly. It can become considerably more difficult. We're commanded to trust him even when we do not understand what he's doing. When you don't understand, trust becomes an inconvenience. Like Abraham and Noah discovered, learning to trust God is a process. Faithful obedience to the word of the Lord was a pivotal part of the learning process for them, just like it is for us. It's likely that we've made the mistake of trusting the wrong people in our lives, being hurt or harmed. And it's even more likely that we've trusted our own selves to our own detriment. We must learn from our trust falls and our trust fails. And remember that the only one that we can trust in completely and without inhibition is the Lord Jesus Christ. We often find it easier to trust him with our future than we do with our present. With the eternal, so much more than the temporal. However, we must learn to trust him with both. Tragedy ensues when trust is betrayed. When we try to lean on something that is not reliable, something that's not true or able, or simply is not strong enough to hold us, it never works out in our favor. The Bible is definitive when it speaks on whom we can trust. The Proverbs reads in Proverbs chapter 3 and verses 5, and say, not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. So what about you this morning? Is there something you're withholding from God? Is there an area of your life that has been off limits to the Lord that you've not trusted him for? Has he proven himself faithful to his covenant, to those walking with him in covenant? Let Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, let them be the example to show you that God has proven himself faithful. And let their God be your God. If we could all, let's bow our heads as we close out Sunday school this morning. Father,